Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Corey Pierce, and I'm the Marketing Director here at Churn, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled Surprising Insights About Customer Health Scores and Its Impact on Reoccurring Revenue. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are recording this session, and we'll send out a link to the recording 24 hours after this webinar. We'd also like to invite you to go ahead and submit your questions as we go through the presentation, and we'll try and answer them as we go, and then we will also have a Q&A portion at the end of this webinar. Now, I'm pleased to introduce to you our presenter today. We have Irit Eizips, Chief Customer Officer and CEO of CSM Practice, which is the CS consulting firm. They recently conducted a survey of CS professionals on how they build, maintain, and measure customer health scores. And those results are going to be shared with you today. So with that, I will kick it off to you, Irit.
Hey guys, thanks for joining me. I'm super excited to be here today. In Q4 2020, we sent many of you a link to a survey about, how are you doing your customer health scores? We have a lot of assumptions about customer health scores, why we should be doing those, how should we set those up? And I think a lot of the blogs out there are a little bit outdated. So we set ourselves a goal to see what are the recent trends, and I'm super happy and excited to share those with you. For those who don't know me, my name is Irit Eizips. I've been in this space since 2013 and have been just working on different methodologies and strategies for customer success teams. And I am part of a company called CSM Practice, which I founded in 2014. It was one of the first companies in the world to just focus on customer success strategy consulting services. And as part of what we do, we actually work with a lot of different companies to set up the customer health score, really understand how to do it correctly. So we've seen what works and what doesn't. And this was part of the background for why we did this survey, is to really bring to light some of the trends that we're seeing and what works and what doesn't. So hopefully today was going to be a super interesting session. My goal is to make sure that once you understand why this is working and why it's not working, you can have a lot of takeaways out of this webinar to actually revisit how you do customer health scores and make it a lot better and avoid some of the mistakes. And before I start, I just want to say a big thank you for Churn for opening your platform to share these customer survey results with customer health score surveys results with everyone. So thank you so much for having me. Okay, so the survey results, I would say there's three main outcomes from the survey. One is who is using the customer health score. We have a lot of assumptions around that. I was a bit surprised about some of the survey results that we've seen, and I think you'd be as well. The true impact of customer health score, we usually build it for one reason, but then the impact, I think, is really surprising to see where does it really impact and where does it not. So stay tuned for that. And then lastly, how do people do customer health scores these days? What metrics are they including? How often are they updating it? What do they use that works really well for them and what doesn't work very well? So stay tuned. We have a lot. At the end of the webinar, I know this is like a 1 hour, but at the end of the 45 minutes that I have allotted to speak about this, I will give you 5 different resources for you to learn more about the topic and get better at customer health scores in general, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you do have a question, by the way, that's relevant to one of my slides, I asked Corey to, allow the time to kind of ask the questions as I go through the slide deck. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them before the end. And if we can, we take a break and we'll address some of these questions as we go along. If not, that's totally fine too. All right, let's get started. So who is actually creating customer health scores? Well, we know it's the customer success team typically, but what type of companies? Here's what we found out. So before we start, actually, I just wanted to know, like, how many of you are actually already having a customer health score? And I think that would give us kind of like a sense of how many are actually doing it in doing or performing or maintaining a customer health score in general. So go ahead and click on the vote. All right, I think we're ready to present. Share the results. Yeah, So most of you actually do have a customer health score. Let's see if you fall into some of the statistics that we've seen. So I think we can hide those now. And let's see what we're seeing. So we actually asked everybody that participated in the survey. We had close to 200 participants. What is the customer health score, and who are you using it or not, and what kind of, how big is your team? And as you can see, the larger the team, the more often we're seeing the customer health score being built and maintained. And I think that makes sense, but it's like 31% point more common in larger teams than it is for smaller teams. We've also seen that companies that have a large customer base have a better propensity for having a customer health score versus those that don't, but not by a whole lot. We've also noted that 30% of the customer health score, the companies that answered, 30% of them are actually in SaaS versus on-premise or services organizations, so it's much more predominant. We have some guesses around why this happens, and I think we'll kind of learn when we see what is the customer health score being comprised of. We'll understand why this is a trend, so stay tuned for that. You can see there's almost like a 30% gap between services companies to SaaS companies, and then technology companies that don't have any kind of usage data or SaaS platforms lag behind. Now, we also asked them, do you have a customer health score? And we wanted to see if there's a correlation between the number of customers that a CSM manages for the need of customer health score. And I think most of us, I'm just gonna guess here, most of us, including myself, always thought that the more customers each CSM needs to handle, the more they will need a customer health score. And so when I posed this question, I actually thought that what we'll see is the reverse trend. We'll see the higher the CSM ratio, the more predominant as a customer health score would be, but not so. We're actually seeing that the more popular the health score, the less accounts the CSM manages. So the higher touch model that we have, the more likely the team is to actually manage a customer health score. You can see this clearly in this graph. So it's much more prevalent when the CSM ratio is low and when it's a higher touch model. But then we also saw that even the cadence supported the other slide. So the higher the cadence, the more I know about the customer, and then the more the propensity is actually to maintain and hold, like where we might have had some try to create a customer health score, but then I think that when the CSM ratio is really high, the reliability of the score drops, and therefore that initiative is being let go. Oh, one more thing. Note how little do we have a customer health score with a self-serve. That's very, very low. You would think it would be reverse, right? So to recap, who is using a customer health score? We're seeing it more prevalent in large customer teams, when we have a large customer base, which is what we would expect, a low CSM to customer ratio, which is a little bit surprising. And when we have a high touch model, then we see the customer health score being much more popular, and mainly with SaaS companies. So just think to yourself, how many were completely surprised about that? Okay, so let's take a look at the true impact of the customer health score. The first thing that we wanted to ask is, what are the skill sets and what are the strong suits that customer success teams have? So as a side question, we asked them, what are your top strengths as a team? And we were expecting that customer success teams that have a health score would be more proactive, would be able to better prioritize tasks because now they have the health score so they can address the red clients first, or maybe have better visibility to adaptation and overall health. But you'll see that the ones that have versus the ones that didn't actually had the same top three, best practices and strengths And so there wasn't a big differentiator. And so when we opened it up to the top 5, we actually noted that these two attributes of teams and strengths were a much more predominant for customer success teams with the health score, whereas the ones that didn't really have like a 4th and a 5th that were much more predominant. So the conclusion was that the health score sometimes is kind of like an index for the CSM to say, what should I be focusing on? What is important here? And so with that, you can actually scale the team because the role and definitions of the customer success manager are much more clear. And then with a health score, ideally, we can support scalability as well. I thought that was surprising, by the way. Okay, so then we asked them, we thought maybe there's a correlation between the ability to do expansion selling and monitoring for health. Well, that wasn't exactly the case, and we couldn't really find a clear indication that if you do have a health score, you will have better upsell and cross-sell indications, and that you can use the health score as a stoplight to say green, they're ready for an upsell. Most of you did not have that, and it was very all over the place. So then we analyzed the data further, and we said, well, can we slice and dice the data in different ways to see which team does have, higher health score in general? And so we couldn't really find anything. You could see that it doesn't matter how you update the health score and if you have one or not, it was just really literally all over the place. So this might mean that health scores are literally not designed to increase upsell and expansion, and it's just the way that they're built that's just not aligned to that goal, and therefore there's no correlation. But I will say that every now and then I do get a phone call from a client that says, hey, can we build a health score so that if they're green, we can upsell them, and if they're red, we know that the renewal is at risk. So I want to say this is not a trend that we're seeing really as a health score being helpful with expansion selling. We also found no clear connection between churn rates and the use of a health score. So we looked at all the data and we looked, okay, for the ones that have a very low churn rate, do we see a health score being predominant? That was not the case either. What we did find is that in these brackets, the lower brackets of churn, we actually found that the ones that had the lowest churn rate were using a health score. Does it mean that because they were using a health score, they were able to mitigate churn risk better? Not necessarily, but we did find, because you could see already in the 5 and 10, this kind of trend is being broken. What did we find is that companies that in 2020, we had the pandemic, people had an increase in churn rate or a significant decrease in churn rate, but we did find that whatever it was, companies that did have a customer health score had better control over it. So the ones that reduced the customer health score were able to get better results if they did have a health score. So they were able to lower the churn rate a lot more. And the ones that didn't have it, if they had an increase in the churn rate, it was much higher than the ones that did. So in other words, while the churn, having a health score doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to reduce your churn rates, it does help you have some sort of a control over what's going on and being able to be a little bit more fast in reaction to it. And because of that transparency that occurs. What else did we find? Well, it was very surprising, when we said, well, that's it. That's all we can find about lowering churn rate. So we did a little bit more digging into the data, and we also found that very clearly that the ones that had the lowest churn rates in these two brackets were the ones that were either using their CRM application or a customer success software. So while there wasn't a clear indication that the health score may impact for a lower churn rate, we did find that if your team is using a CRM application or a customer success software to manage your customer success team, you will see, in general, lower churn rates. So if you had to make an investment in something, obviously having some sort of system that helps you gauge what's going on, have you have the right playbooks in place, and highlight various things that happens in the customer, meaning a customer 360 view, that already helps reducing churn a lot, whether you have a customer health score or not. Now, why is all this happening? Right? I think that the main reason is in this question that we asked everyone. We asked them, why are you creating a customer health score in the first place? And, a lot of the management team still dictates why the health score is being built. And a lot of them have this presumption that the health score will help them predict churn better or help them get the renewal forecast accuracy a lot better. We know for a fact that that's not really, like, 16% want to identify upsell opportunities. Guys, we know the survey have already revealed there's no specific correlation between upsell, cross-sell, or lowering churn rate just by having a health score. So already like over 50% are setting it up for all the wrong reasons. What we do see is that, the health score should be a highlight for whether or not a customer is getting some sort of an ROI from your solution and from your everything that you have, the partnership itself. And so the more that they generate value from your services and platform, the higher the ROI, and then the more likely they are to renew. We know that for a fact that if a customer is using your software more, it doesn't mean that they're not going to churn. They have an NPS score that's high or low, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to churn or renew next year. But we do know that ROI and the awareness of value delivered is a great indicator for renewals. And look at how many are designing their health score to identify that, less than 1%. And I think that that's one of the key reasons why we're seeing the health score not having a great correlation with churn. So we'll talk about why is this happening, and I think that this is kind of like magnifies itself when we look at how the customer health scores are being built today. Okay, so what can we say about renewal forecast? So if you do have a customer health score, you do get a higher renewal forecast accuracy only if you're using a CRM application or customer success software. If you're doing your health score still in spreadsheets, then that sort of like doesn't necessarily get it where it needs to be. So to recap, teams that are maintaining a customer health score are much more focused and much more scalable. The churn rate is lower when the customer health score is present, but especially when you have a customer success software and a CRM application, otherwise there's no guarantee that it's going to impact it in a favorable way because there's no apparent correlation between customer health score, upsell and cross-sell, or even churn data. And then there's no real correlation between renewal forecast accuracy unless you're using tools in addition to that. So something to think about in terms of prioritizing things. Where do you want your team to invest? If you were to get better results next year, what should you be investing in before you set up a customer health score? Okay, so let's say you already have a CRM system in place or a CS application in place like Churn, and you wanted to really tailor the customer health score in a way that's effective. Let's take a look at what other teams are doing. Okay, so one of the aspects of a health score is like how often do you actually update the formula or the algorithm. So we're gonna open the polls, and I'd like to all to share like how often do you actually revisit the customer health score formula if you have one, and share it with everybody. Okay, we're still getting a lot of results. 40% of you have already voted. Come on, we want to see what you're doing. Okay, so maybe we can share the responses. you can see it's a little bit all over the place, but 37% never update the customer health score, 35% annually, and 29% quarterly. Let's see what we got in our survey. Okay, so this is just the algorithm. This is not how often your CSM is updating the score, right? So very much aligned with what you guys had. The survey that we did, 48% actually updated annually. That's very, very close to what we did today in the webinar. Now, listen, when I presented it to our advisory board for CSM Practice, a lot of them questioned the quarterly because they said, you know, if you update it quarterly, how can you then show improvement trends that you're actually going in the right direction? There's something to be said about that. But I think many of us found that during COVID in 2020, you know, things changed so much. I had some companies that I worked with where, you know, usage stopped altogether for a while. And so usage wasn't a really great metric to say, are they healthy or not? Because in the meantime, they extended contracts or they did other things, or maybe there were certain functionalities that weren't as used as they did before, and we just needed to pivot to something else. So doing it quarterly, there's another reason why companies doing it quarterly and revisiting the customer health score. When you set up the customer health score in the correct way, it should align to help the customer success manager focus on what activities and behaviors we should be focused on working with a customer. So we can proactively set, all right, if we have all these different metrics and different behaviors that I want from the customer, where does the customer doing really well? It could be a very healthy account, but still maybe the executive is not as engaged or they haven't taken training in a while. Doesn't mean that they're gonna churn. A good customer health score is always true. There's no false negatives. It's just areas that I'd like to work on with the customer and what is this area that I need to work on. And so if I'm already getting really great, this is an area that all the customers are mostly green, you know, it's an area that I'm doing really well, maybe I want to add another area that I want the team to focus on to start getting better at. Maybe it's their involvement in our user community. You know, I want to start scoring that. And then so if it's red, I know as a CSM, I need to reach out and educate them about that. So that's why I think some executives are actual CS leaders are looking at the customer health score and saying, is there another thing that I should be adding now if my customer success strategy has changed or I want to promote a certain behavior from the CSM to start focusing on with customers? What are they including in the customer health score? So the top results were usage, level of engagement, and level of relationships. So I'll break it down for you. Usage, obviously, you know, we had predominantly many of you in SaaS companies doing this, so most of you have access to usage. Again, I think usage is a great metric, not necessarily to predict renewal, but it's a great metric to say, is the customer healthy? How are they using? How often are they using our systems? Are they using our differentiating features, sticky features? You know, there's a great way to leverage usage data in a productive way for a customer health score. So that's great. Engagement means a lot of softwares can attach themselves to your mail server and say, for every email that you sent out, how many emails did you get back? Or how many touch points did you have with this customer? How many meetings did you have with them? Have they attended? Did they cancel? So that just shows the level of engagement that the customer has with you. Relationships, look, there's like plethora of blogs and YouTube videos about how do you do significant relationships with customers. I did a video with Ziv Peled just a few months ago that was released on my YouTube YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/CSM Practice. You can find that video. He actually goes through how they score the relationship inside their CRM application. So they set up a whole custom object just to manage that, so that not only they know, they actually score each account for the level of relationship that they have. Do they know their families? When was the last time they reached out? Who has the level of the relationship? Is the CSM to the admin, or is it the CEO to the client CEO? So they score all of that. It's a very comprehensive framework. Definitely recommend learning more about that. And so these are the top 3, guys. What else did we find? These are all the top metrics that we found. Everything else was like completely random. We put under other, but you could see that usage is almost, and customer engagements are almost twice as much as use of resources and business impact or ROI. Now, if we think about why is this, is because a lot of you want to automate the customer health score so you can scale. But honestly, you know, usage is not a good indicator for renewal or churn. It's just a good indicator to say what's the level of adoption and is the adoption optimized. I think I would love to see more customer health scores actually say, you know, is the customer getting value from us? And if you think about value metrics, these 2 here are great indication as to whether or not they're not only getting value from the system, but are they actually using all the resources we provide them to their disposal to really get the maximum ROI from the partnership. So honestly, this was a little bit disappointment for me to see this, because I'd love to get some more education around how to build a solid customer health score that maximizes value for customers, because we know that's the #1 correlation to renewals and maximizing profitability with your customer install base. Okay, then we asked, you know, if you had a CSM team, how often do they update the score? And this is also a little bit surprising because some of them only updating once a year. And I think that this is, or quarterly, and I think that this is for companies that, you know, have contracts for 3 years and 7 years with clients. If you have a month-to-month renewal, you're obviously going to update it daily or weekly, or at the very least monthly. So I think that this is reassuring to see that the most of you are actually updating it on a consistent and frequent basis. Okay, so how many are actually tracking the health scores using a CS software or a CRM system? You can see that 79% of you do it either in a CRM application or a customer success software. And then, you know, some of them are actually still doing it in a spreadsheet or some other tool. God knows what this is, maybe like, you know, one of those online tools that we have there, like Smartsheets. So for those of you who still do it in a more manual way, the issue with that is that it's not reportable. You can create action item based on red flags. And honestly, sometimes, you know, I know some of my customers start with a spreadsheet just to see if the health score works. So maybe there's like an interim period when you do it on a spreadsheet, but then you definitely want to move it into a CS application. That would be my high recommendation versus a CRM application. Still, I know some of you still do it in a CRM application. The reason you want to do customer health score in a CS application is because customer success applications actually have a much better module to not only configure the health score and reconfigure it in an agile manner, but they're also set up to create better reports, better dashboards, so you as an executive can actually go in and see what the trends are, what are the areas that you're doing the best, and how can you support your CSMs in promoting a certain area to get better at with additional processes or tools. And it also has this component where you can have an action item for the customer success manager if a score is in red. So you can get a better consistency of customer experience and the scalability around processes that your CSMs execute in a more cohesive way. Okay, then some of you might have a health score even in a customer success application, but it's still updated manually versus strictly automatically from data. So it was really cool to see that 29% is completely automated. But I think that in these cases, you need to really rely on usage data, survey data, and we know that that's limited because it's really hard to automatically calculate for value and ROI. So no wonder that some of you are just purely doing it manually, especially with the survey results showing that it's a high touch model for the most part that's using health score. Makes a lot of sense. And for the most part, you'd see the highest percentage is those who have like a hybrid model where the customer health score has some metrics that are automated and some that are manual. And I would say that this is my experience as well, where we would build a customer health score and we can automate some of it, but some of it would stay in a manual manner, especially if it's for a high touch CSM model. Okay, so to just recap, usage, engagement, relationships were the top components to be used by most companies in a customer health score. 79% use a dedicated customer success software or a CRM application to maintain the customer health score. 33% automated completely manually and 29% purely automatically. And then 58% update their customer health score daily or monthly at the most. And so check if your team does it as frequently. And then 48% update their algorithm once a year, which I think is super healthy unless something is significant is happening with your company or team. And then 46% use the customer health score to forecast churn or renewals, which I think really is questionable. You really need to look at your formula to say, have I only included metrics that at a high probability predict churn or renewal, or do I have some other stuff in there that doesn't necessarily say for sure that if it's green, that the customer will renew? I want you to carefully look at that as homework for yourselves. Okay, this was the survey results. I hope you had some aha moments, some like questionable moments. I know when I saw it the first time, I was like, what? I don't know, I wasn't really sure about everything. And so we had to analyze it and revalidate everything. But I thought it was super interesting. And it definitely showcased, what do we need to focus on? Where do we need to fix things? Even as a community, on how do we approach customer health scores? And so for those of you who haven't started with a health score, has a health score that doesn't really work, I want to open it up with 5 resources that I'd like to share with you that can get you jumpstart on your customer health score strategy. So first of all, we created a comprehensive blog about customer health scores that not only shares the survey results, but also has additional information about how to build a health score. So I highly recommend watching that. We also shared the customer health score results with our advisory board for CSM Practice, and they shared a ton of tips of, how do they approach customer health scores in their companies and what they have seen works best. So more tips on this video. We created an infographic that recaps all the different statistics around customer health scores. So if you wanted to share it with other team members, you're welcome to download it. I created this bit.ly survey health score for you to quickly get access to it. And if you want today's slide, you can basically text the word health score to number 480-418-1411. Fifth resource is CSM Practice. We'd be happy to help. So if you do need to completely revamp your customer health score, feel free to reach to us. This is one of the things that we do to help customer success teams completely change and improve their strategy. We're happy to talk and kind of share our best practices and help your company not only build the health score, but create the playbooks related to the health score. Think about what dashboards you need. How often do you need to augment it? What do you need to really revamp your strategy based on the trends, and kind of think about some leadership processes that you need to put in place? So quite comprehensive to have a health score. It's not just the score. And so with that, I just want to thank you and open it up for questions if you have any.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have had a number of questions come in. I'd like to encourage others to go ahead and submit those, and we'll go through them now. So I think maybe some people joined in a little bit late. Could you repeat who you surveyed, or how many respondents and kind of what their demographic was?
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily look at a specific demographic. We actually had, I think for the most part, people from the US, but I know for a fact that we had people from India, Israel, and Europe, the UK mainly. So it was a little bit global, if you know what I mean. So hopefully in terms of demographic, that helps.
Awesome. We have a question that says, is there a maximum number of health score components or factors you would recommend including in your model? And if so, maybe what are some of the most common ones you have found?
Yeah, so it really depends what you're trying to pull off. If you were to create a health score that's really a churn index, you want to have as many components that typically trigger a high risk for churn. So usually that's about 8 or 10 metrics at the most. Now, if you're gonna create a health score that's an indication for the CSM to say, what should I be focusing on, or something that um, allows them to understand what behaviors or activities that should be focused on, that could include a lot more because it will always be true. So a red means, hey, you haven't done this with a client, or they haven't worked on this with a client. And so it just means that a customer that has a lower score doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to churn, but they're not getting enough attention, or they're not on the right track to become best in class. And so for those types of scores, I've heard different executives having anywhere between 8 to 20 different metrics. And then if you do have a lot, you kind of want to group them by, maybe sub-metrics, all the metrics related to relationships, all metrics related to expansions or whatnot. So you have like sub-health scores that aggregate to the total of the overall health of the customer, but distinct between health and health. So there's churn index, and then there's a health score to say, are they becoming best in class? And I think that if you could do that, the best in class type of health score, the one that kind of indicates, are they getting enough value, is always true. And it doesn't matter how many components you have in there. It's not uncommon to have like 20 components in it.
Okay. We have another question that was asking, do you recommend having different health score models for different segments within your customer base, or is it best to have one for all?
Yeah, excellent question. So yes, especially if the customers are using, for example, completely different products. Might make total sense to have a completely different health score. You can also have a different health score for onboarding versus ones that do have the system in place. And this would be extremely important for those of you who have an enterprise application that's a bit more robust, where the implementation process might take a little bit time. Less important for the ones that maybe it's a plugin, you self-serve. In that regard, you might want to have a health score for if you have a proof of concept or a trial period, you want to have a score for that as well. Anything that can highlight different phases in the customer life cycle. So those would be like the two, and then you can have a health score for different propositions or goals. You saw that there was like this big cycle. You could have a health score that indicates, are they ready for expansion? Could be like an expansion index. What are you going to include in that? Just setting up a health score that says the customer is on their way to becoming best in class and super green doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready for an expansion. There might be other things in the usage data that actually can tell you that they're ready for an expansion. And you can take a look, for example, you could have a complete statistical analysis on your usage data and say, well, customers that have these 3 features usually opt into these 5 modules. And so if you can identify all the customers that have these 3 features that did not opt into these additional things, those might be a really good customer base to approach them with this initiative and kind of say, hey, other customers that are using this, we benchmark you against others. This is what we're finding. Let's take a look if this is applicable for you. So I want to kind of like break the notion that a health score, green means expansion and red means churn. That assumption is dead. We already know it doesn't work. Let's just build it differently. Build different health scores for different things, and let's name them differently. And I think everybody here will have a much better way to being proactive, predictive, and much more efficient with our customer base.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I do think pairing health scores and segmentation together becomes really powerful. So you talked about, updating your customer health score and how often you should do that. How would you go about evaluating if a health score is good or if it's not working?
Well, I would say just look at your key KPIs as a team. What you want to do is set up a health score and say, what is the purpose of it? And if it doesn't help you get there, then obviously something is wrong. And another thing is like if your health score is on occasion producing false positives or false negatives, then the customer health score doesn't work either, because then it's not a reliable metric. You kind of want to say, I want to create a metric that's always true, or always, that I can always rely on. If the metric components are just not producing consistent results, then it's definitely something that you want to reconsider and reconfigure.
Awesome. Trying to go through, we've had a lot come in, so trying to pick a few. Any recommendations on how to include ROI elements into a customer health score?
Great question. So an ROI, to kind of understand what it is for your customers, you have to sort of like outline 5 or 6 different outcomes that your customers can achieve. And then ask yourself, if I was the executive at the client side, what are the key metrics that I'm concerned with, and how does this outcome relate to my key metrics? So let's say you sell into, I don't know, the finance office, and their key metrics are to complete their accounting cycle quickly or without delays or whatever it is, right? Then you can say, okay, I have an application that can help them with that. Did you actually do that? Or are there certain modules that can support the cycle to be more accurate and faster? And so you kind of want to say, all right, these are the modules that we recommend for this KPI. And now you can actually solidify an ROI discussion with these customers. The best way to do it with your CSMs is actually identify those key use cases and say, has the customer actually had a moment of value with us? Were we actually able to enable something for them or change something in their organization so that they can get this outcome, and have we document in some sort of a customer story with them where they acknowledge that this value was received? And then it's most likely a manual metric in that regard if it's a high touch model. If it's a low touch, some applications actually, have this notion, let's say a marketing application where you have a ton of leads and your goal is to get them to have more revenues or more conversations with prospects. And you can certainly count that, like how many views did you have for every lead page, and how many phone calls did you get based on that lead page, and you can actually show ROI really quickly. So it all depends on your solution, whether or not you could do it automatically.
Got it. Our next question is, would you recommend having qualitative data inside of a health score that might be subjective from a CSM, or focusing mostly on quantitative, more automated inputs?
It depends on the strategy. So for high touch models, definitely qualitative is one of the ways to go. Again, thinking about a health score as an indicator of the customer becoming best in class. Qualitative is not a problem in that regard. I think the trick is to make sure that you have clear definitions, so it doesn't become, whatever I think, but these conditions have been met, therefore this client is in green, in yellow, or red. And then for quantitative, I think that would be great if it's data that's really hard to access. You have to run a report manually. It's time consuming. If you can get it from a system, put it in your customer success software, and then create a quick metric that's calculated for the CSM, and you can introduce productivity around that. I think that's nothing wrong with that, actually, if it helps the CSM focus on the right things.
Got it. We have a question that says, in what ways do you recommend leveraging a customer health score outside of just renewal management?
Well, obviously, I'm a big fan of using it for either the onboarding phase. Definitely want to have a health score for that. And so the other way to think about it is sort of like, what does the adoption phase look like? That's the most predominant use, where you want to maximize value for the client and make sure you have a strong partnership with them. And so for that phase, you would actually define it based on like a value score. How much value are they getting? Are they in my user community groups? Are they attending my webinars? What's the level of engagement? Do I have the right relationships? You want to have those kind of metrics included besides the usage, of course. Have they taken training? Do they have a dedicated admin? Like, what's going on there? And sort of like start outlining all those things that just says, is this a best-in-class customer, yes or no? That should be your primary health score. And then on top of that, you could say, all right, let's identify all the different triggers that if these incidents happen, that means that the customer at 60, 70% probability or higher are definitely going to churn. That should be your churn index, or your code red flag that's being calculated separately. We know customers could be best in class and really using the system and getting all the resources, but still, you might lose the executive sponsor, and all of a sudden you get a new executive that's gung-ho about a different solution. So you kind of want to prepare for these things and make sure that you tackle all angles by having the appropriate metric. So hopefully that addressed your question fully.
Yeah, we also had another question that came in. What type of qualitative factors would you put in to measure the relationship?
To measure the relationship? Okay, so you can start with when was the last time that somebody connected with that account? I would actually score, and again, I highly recommend watching Ziv Pelled's video on our channel because you actually get the screenshots of everything that he included. I'm just repeating his thought leadership here. So he actually says, how deep is the relationship? Like, do I know their family, or did I just meet them once? Like, can I score from 1 to 5? How well do I know them? Can I score the level of the relationship? So am I at the tactical level, just really buddies with the admin? The technical admin doesn't influence the decision for renewal, but doesn't really, gets to say, doesn't own the budget. Or do I have an executive alignment? So this could be another way to score a relationship. But again, like I highly recommend hearing it from the guru's mouth and just listening to that video. And yeah, I think there's a lot of great insights that Ziv shares around this topic. So.
Awesome. This might be a little bit of a technical question. Do you have any recommendations on how to deal with null values for one of your churn, one of
Yes.
your health score factors if you don't have that value?
Yeah, you know what? That's more common. Nobody talks about it, but the old NA. Yeah, you know what? Sometimes you will have customers and you would say, best practices is them to activate or mandate this feature. Okay, you had a conversation with them. They actually have a different tool for that specific feature. There's no way they're going to do it. There's no way they're going to integrate something because they already have something else in place by the time they purchased you and they're not interested in this point. You're going to put them on red. You know that this is not the use case for them or it's just not applicable for them in any reason. So we actually do encourage our customers to put things in NA so you don't get like major reds where it's not even applicable. You already validated that point. It's not relevant for this customer. Just put it on NA or a white score so that it doesn't impact your formula. But I will say it needs to be used sporadically, as needed. It's not something you want to encourage all your CSMs to do, especially if you do think that, well, maybe next year or something like that, we should open the conversation up again. So yes, absolutely. If you have a lot of white ones, by the way, that means that you might need to have a different score for a cohort of clients. Let's say you just mark white for all your financial institute kind of clients because they're banks and they don't need that feature. Okay, so maybe you should just have a different formula for different industries.
Thanks. I think that's really smart. And like you said, something that you might not consider when you start setting out developing a health score. We have a question, and I know this wasn't asked in your survey, so I guess maybe just more what you typically see. Have you seen a relationship between CSM rotation and a client's health?
CSM rotation? Oh,
Like
like
I guess maybe
we
like
have a lot of
turnover
reds.
counts
The
and
CSMs don't want to work there anymore. Look, that's why we always highly recommend that management. Look, the health score is not just to predict renewals And it's not just to give the CSM an area of focus to work on. And if they leave a lot, that means that the health score is being abused a little bit, right? To kind of say, oh, Mr. CSM, you're not doing your job properly, versus looking at it as an opportunity to actually give yourselves as team leaders a perspective of, where should we as a company invest more? We're seeing certain areas, let's say we don't have a lot of executive relationships. Maybe that's an area that we can work on as a company. And at the executive level, we need to think, oh, should we build an executive alignment program? How can we support the CSM at the top level to get the results that we want? It just usually is just an indication that there's a lack in policy or policies or processes that we can embed in the system, or tools that we can give the CSMs, or additional webinars or whatnot to create awareness that we just need to address at a higher level and add some budget to improve overall. So I think when you're seeing a high correlation between CSM leaving the company and unfortunately a lot of red accounts, that means that there's a lack of ownership about these trends from the leadership team, and they're just not using the solution or that tool, the customer success health score, in an appropriate manner.
Got it. So we have a question that says, our company has both high touch and low touch accounts. Would it be good to create a different health score for both?
Yeah, just because, for the high touch, you can actually have qualitative metrics that you don't want to miss. And then for the lower touch, you kind of want to put more emphasis on how engaged are they with your digital assets. And so the way that you would use the health score for the digital assets, the self-serve cohort or the SMBs, is to say, okay, what area, what are they participating in? What are they not? Where can I make more investments? What works, what doesn't? Whereas for the high touch, it would be, can we make them best in class? Do we have the right relationships? It's a little bit different questions. I mean, at the end of the day, you want everybody to get maximum value. You're just doing it completely different. And it's not uncommon that for the SMB, the long tail customers, you would have a separate team just to make sure that that cohort is being successful and supported. You will probably hire completely different types of CSMs to handle that cohort as well. And so, I would definitely recommend a different health score for that segment.
Awesome. Yep. We have a question that says, in your experience, where have you seen CRMs fall short compared to managing your customer health score in a CS platform?
Oy, where do I start? Look, CRM systems, it's nice, you set it up, you get some dashboards. It's not easy to maintain. If you need to make any changes, now you need to call IT to make the change. They don't have a sophisticated algorithm. So if you wanted to have some sort of a rule behind it that automatically calculates the score in a more robust way, in a more sophisticated way, the CRM systems are going to fall short. Sorry. Customer health scores are customer success systems are much more adapted in making sure that your customer health score is adjusted to what you need. They can do sub health scores, they can update the metrics and potentially show you where your formula fails, and you can do a lot more things in customer success softwares versus CRM. CRM's the health score is very, very basic. It's a point of start until you get a customer success software.
I think we would definitely agree with that as well. So we've gone through a lot of questions. Thank you so much for sharing with us your results from the survey and going through all the questions, and also providing those additional resources to our audience members. I think that's really great. I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and a link to the slides that Irit already shared. And then at the end of this webinar, survey will pop up, and we'd love if you take a moment just to give your feedback on the content and just our program today, and we'd love to keep that in mind for future webinars. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks again Churn for having me.
Thank you.